On April 9th, 2018, police in the small city of Wadsworth, Ohio, received a call from an anxious family.
Wadsworth Police.
Yes, this is Howard Leisure. My aunt lives on Portage Street. A friend of ours stopped over there yesterday to check on her, and she was nowhere to be found.
Okay.
He says papers were on the porch for the last 3 days.
What's her name?
Margaret Douglas.
Margaret Douglas was 98. Her relatives, worried that she hadn't been seen in 3 days, called the police to report that she was missing. At nearly 100 years old, her age was usually their primary concern, that she might have had a fall inside her house or otherwise experienced a health issue. It therefore rang serious alarm bells that she couldn't be found inside her house at all.
We don't know where she's at. She's 98 years old.
Did she live there by herself?
She lives there by herself, yeah. And she never locks her house.
Where was she? What had happened to her? And what did this Ohio teen have to do with it?
Well, we just have to figure out what's going on with you, okay?
This is the chilling story of Margaret Douglas's tragic demise.
Went missing.
On the evening of April 9th, as there continued to be no luck in the search for Margaret, Howard and Cindy Leisure arrived at Margaret's house to help. Margaret was Howard's aunt and had no children of her own, with the result that her nieces and nephews were her closest family and looked out for her like she was their mom. They knew their aunt's habits, such as the belongings she would take with her when she left the house, including a red wallet she used to carry her cards and cash, and the clothes she would wear. Howard went to look in the closet to see what he could find and made a truly tragic discovery. The clothes had been pulled down from the rail to pile up on the floor of the closet. He spotted one of his aunt's shoes beneath the pile and leaned down to take a closer look and discovered his aunt's murdered body hidden in the closet of her own house. The closet was tiny, only 1.5 by 2.5 feet, and Margaret's body had been contorted to fit inside it. She was in her nightgown, which was torn. She had bruises to her head and face and marks on her neck that suggested she had been strangled. The condition of her body showed that she had been lying there dead for a few days, since about the time she had been last seen. Forensics examined the crime scene, taking samples of DNA and fingerprints, which they tested against Margaret's relatives to rule them out. The samples did not match. Whoever had killed her was at this point unknown to the police. They began to suspect a burglary. This was because Margaret's red wallet was missing. It wasn't surprising that there were no signs of forced entry in the house because Margaret usually didn't lock her doors, trusting in the safety of her neighborhood and the support of those who lived around her. She couldn't have known that someone would take advantage to invade her property and take her life. The only other clue in the house was a plastic food service glove discovered in the backyard. This suggested that the killer had had the forethought to prepare for the crime so as not to leave any DNA or fingerprints behind. But in their haste to get away afterwards, they had dropped this key piece of evidence. What did the glove mean? Who had left it there? Had Margaret been targeted, or was this a random killing? To discover the answers to these questions, the investigators interviewed her family.
Does she have a power of attorney or a will or anything, Matt?
No. We've been telling her she needs a will, she needs this. She would never get the time to do it.
There was no one who stood to gain financially by Margaret's death. She was also a peaceful, friendly person.
Any problems with her? Does she want to argue with people or anything like that? Nothing?
No, sweet old lady.
This was what Howard told the police, and Cindy concurred.
And nobody else, she didn't, have any problems with anybody that...
Not that I know of. Margaret bothered me everything. That's why it's so just horrible.
Let's learn a bit more about who Margaret Douglas was. Born on September 15, 1919 in Akron, Ohio, she had 2 sisters and 1 brother, all of whom had died by 2018. She herself had lived through many of the 20th century's major events: Wall Street crash, the Second World War, the moon landings, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, to name but a few. In that time, she rarely left Ohio, but lived a fulfilled and vibrant life there, working at an O'Neill's in Akron as a young woman, which gave her the opportunity to meet a lot of people and suited her outgoing nature. After World War II, Margaret married the love of her life, an Army veteran named Donald Douglas, who worked at the Ohio Match Company. They moved into the house in Wadsworth that Margaret would live in for the next 70 years, and though they did not have children, they were satisfied with their lives together, traveling, going to ball games, especially the Cleveland Indians, and gardening. Donald sadly died in 2000, but Margaret chose to remain in the house they'd shared since it was situated in a friendly community that held good memories for her. She was close with some of her neighbors who kept an eye out for her as she got older and more infirm, including a man named David Klinkenbeard who checked on her a couple of times a week, and she knew all the kids in the neighborhood. Howard and Cindy would do her grocery shopping for her as she became more confined to her house, and she relied on this support network to keep herself healthy and safe, never suspecting that someone would try to harm her deliberately. This was a crime that struck at the heart of this suburb, and everyone wanted it solved. The police continued to canvass the area, and they uncovered a string of car break-ins where small items and change had been stolen. They also wanted to speak to David Klinkenbeard, who wasn't answering their calls. They continued to investigate until the officers noticed someone watching Margaret's house, smoking a cigarette. It turned out to be David Klinkenbeard. He no longer lived in the area, but he wanted to know what was going on and had been conducting his own amateur investigation. The police found this suspicious. He seemed to know details that the public weren't aware of, such as where Margaret had been found and what she'd been wearing at the time. So, on April 11th, 2 days after she was found, they brought David in for questioning. He said he'd last seen Margaret on Wednesday, April 4th, when he'd come over to help her with her trash cans.
You didn't come by on Thursday or Friday, not Sunday.
No, not Sunday.
He said he'd come by again on Sunday, April 8th, but she hadn't answered the door, and not wanting to go up in case she was in a state of undress, he'd contacted a neighbor to let her know he'd been by instead. By this time, Margaret was already dead. This too aroused police suspicion, but when they tested his DNA against the DNA found inside the glove from the backyard, it was not a match. David was not the killer, simply a concerned friend who wanted to know what had happened. This was not back to square one for the investigation, however. They still had the reports of cars broken into in the area, and one crime in particular was of interest. It had taken place in the early hours of April 8th, the day before Margaret's body was discovered. It was a carjacking, an extreme escalation from the reports of petty break-ins, and it had taken place very near to Margaret's house. The victim was a local man called Paul Shalod. 50 years old, he was a church worker and a charitable Good Samaritan. So when he saw what appeared to be a young man, not even 20, limping down the sidewalk in the early hours of the morning, he told the investigators he pulled over and asked if this young man needed help. This would turn out to be a grave mistake. The second Paul got out of the car, the young man sprang to life and dived for the driver's seat, making off with the car in a flash. However, this story wasn't quite adding up. Police found Paul's car abandoned right near the site of the carjacking, undamaged, and when they reviewed nearby CCTV footage, Paul's story was revealed to be false. The young man hadn't been limping, and Paul hadn't stopped to help him. In fact, they'd had a lengthy conversation, with the man leaning into the passenger side window before the man got into the car. A further few minutes passed before Paul suddenly jumped out of the car and the man sped off with it, the only part of the footage that matched with Paul's story. That Paul had lied was highly suspicious. It was the investigators' only lead in Margaret's tragic death, so they presented the footage to Paul and asked him to explain himself. Nervously, he did so, and it turned out to be another false lead. He'd been on an app to try to hook up with men. This was why he'd lied lied about how he met the young man because they'd arranged it on the app and he didn't want his church to know. He told the police that they'd met as planned and begun a sexual encounter inside his car when the man suddenly snapped. He forced Paul out of the car and drove away. Frustratingly, this angle led the police nowhere. There was no way of finding out who the young man was or if he'd been involved in the nearby killing. Still, the investigators continued to focus on petty crime in the area, looking for anything out of the ordinary, and they found it. On the night of April 13th, 4 days after Margaret's body was discovered, the police department received several calls about 2 young men behaving antisocially in Margaret's neighborhood. They also received a call about a break-in to a trailer at a nearby construction site, and one of the perpetrators had left their phone behind at the scene of the crime. This phone belonged to a young man called Zachary. Zachary was already known to the police for petty theft and carjacking, but this time they wanted him for something far more serious: the murder of an elderly woman. They found him sleeping in his car in the local high school's parking lot, and they brought him in for questioning. When confronted with the evidence of his cell phone, he admitted having committed the break-in at the construction site, though he denied any involvement in Paul's carjacking, and he did not admit to the murder. But the CCTV footage taken on the evening of April 13th didn't only show Zachary, it showed someone else too. When the investigators revealed they suspected him of killing Margaret Douglas, Zachary cracked under the pressure and confessed that he had an accomplice who had planned all of their petty crimes and had himself done something much worse. This accomplice was named Gavin Ramsey. Gavin was 17, born in March 2001. The second oldest of 4 boys, he'd always been something of a troublemaker and had been attending counseling on and off for the last 10 years. At the age of 10, his psychologist at the time had noted that he'd chased his siblings with knives, presenting a legitimate concern that he might harm himself or someone else. Now, at 17, he drank and used drugs, and his mother was concerned that nothing she tried was having an effect to better his life. She accompanied him into the interview room when the police brought him in, and initially they only asked about the petty thefts and break-ins.
You guys didn't take anything? Did you rummage through glove boxes or anything?
Maybe like 50 times, but other than that, seriously nothing.
But then they moved on to Paul's carjacking. This was when the mood in the room turned.
We had a carjacking,
Oh my God.
and the suspect is a young white male with a nice complexion and blue eyes. Is that you?
Gavin reacted emotionally.
That upset me so much. Is there something else you need to tell us?
You've already gotten yourself in trouble, so.
I know you. I don't know that.
Gavin asked to speak to the detectives alone. He then confessed to the carjacking with his mom out of the room.
The carjacking, it was me. I'm gonna be honest about it.
However, he denied any interest in Paul's sexual advances.
You guys didn't talk about what kind of sex you were gonna have, or...
No, I don't know, it's not something I'm interested in, just the act of him getting the payback, I guess, I don't know, that's, like, it's karma, really. Like, if you're gonna do that, then I'm gonna rob you.
This spoke to an aggressive criminal mindset that he'd arranged to meet up with Paul only to punish him for a perceived transgression. The investigators pushed on to the matter at the heart of this interview: Margaret Douglas's murder.
There's no reason that we would find your DNA inside her house, because we swabbed the hell out of that house.
You shouldn't.
Gavin denied involvement in Margaret's murder. At this point, the police only had evidence of his petty crimes, so they let him leave with his mom. But they had one request. They asked to see Gavin's phone. They told his mom they were looking for evidence maybe that Gavin had been victimized by men like Paul, but what they found would break the case wide open. Gavin's Google search history was full of searches for the Margaret Douglas case, and far worse, his camera roll contained photos and videos of Margaret Douglas herself, taken the night she'd been killed, Friday, April 6th. At first, they were shot from a stalkerish vantage point, while Margaret didn't know she was being watched, and then they escalated as Gavin attacked. He strangled her and then proceeded to shoot footage of her dead body, including of a sexual nature. These images and videos were kept in a secret folder named Dark. It was password protected, and its password was murder. The investigators acted with sympathy to his claims of adrenaline and confusion, coaxing him to open up before he made a further sick revelation.
I didn't know whose house it was at first until...
Had you talked to her before? I know we discussed this a couple times, but...
It was going to, like when I was 13 or 14, going to shovel track meets and stuff. You know, when I was actually doing something good.
Gavin, who lived in Margaret's neighborhood, right around the corner from her house, had known her. Before his turn towards more antisocial behavior, he claimed to have been a helpful kid, helping his neighbors shovel their driveways, including Margaret Douglas. But knowing her attacker hadn't saved her.
I think about it a lot, and I feel like bad about what I did. Like I don't... Like, I feel bad, I know it's wrong, but I can't express the emotion.
If she was here, what would you say to her?
I'm sorry. That was never meant to happen. If I could take it back, I would.
But Gavin couldn't take it back, and the picture of remorse was complicated by his next admission.
I'll be honest, this Saturday, like, 5 days from now, I was gone. I was leaving.
You're gonna run?
I just needed gas. I needed to get somewhere, and I didn't care what happened.
If the police hadn't found Zachary, and if Zachary hadn't told them about Gavin, Gavin might have escaped without ever facing justice for the awful thing he'd done to a defenseless elderly lady.
Unfortunately, I think he would have hurt more people. Was that in your plan?
I mean, that wasn't in my plan, but I could see that happening.
It seemed the police had stopped a potential serial killer in his tracks.
An arrest made in connection with the death of a 98-year-old Wadsworth woman whose body was found inside of her home. Police say they have a 17-year-old in custody for the death of Margaret Douglas. Douglas's body was found in her Portage Street home last Monday, hidden in a closet beneath various items of clothing.
They placed Gavin under arrest and executed a search warrant on his house, where they found gloves matching the type found in Margaret's backyard. They also found her missing red wallet, stolen from the scene as a trophy. Related to the carjacking, they found a bottle of Hollister cologne stolen out of Paul's car. And most chilling of all, they discovered a journal in which Gavin had written out biographies of famous serial killers and described his own murder fantasies. On one page he wrote, "I just want to fucking go off on someone and beat them until they're not breathing anymore. I honestly want to take someone's life. I want to know what it would feel like to stand over someone's dead body." The year before the murder, he tried to gain employment at a funeral home, possibly to fulfill some of these gruesome ideas. He hadn't succeeded, and so he'd taken to the streets looking for victims instead. Although he was still 17, Gavin was charged as an adult with aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, kidnapping and abuse of a corpse. The DA did not charge him with the alleged carjacking because they did not want to distract from the severity of Margaret's murder. He was arraigned in June 2018 and initially pleaded not guilty. However, when his team's motions to suppress the evidence of his cell phone were denied, he changed his plea to guilty in November 2018. He was evaluated by psychologists in advance of his sentencing hearing and diagnosed with multiple disorders, including conduct disorder and sexual sadism disorder. His mom claimed that her son's actions were as a result of his new Zoloft prescription, given to him in January 2018. However, many of the most horrific pages in the journal had been written before that time, and this did not mitigate his sentence. At his sentencing hearing, Gavin spoke, using many of the same words he'd used in his police interview.
I'm so sorry for what I did. I'm constantly living in bad shape because of it.
He never referred to Margaret as a real person he'd murdered, only talking about it and what he'd done. The judge did not believe his supposed outpouring of remorse. As he'd been 17 at the time of the murder, he was not eligible for the death penalty, but Gavin was sentenced to life in prison without parole. However, in 2021, Ohio Senate Bill 256 was passed, which banned minors from being sentenced to life without parole, making Gavin eligible to appeal for parole 25 years later, in 2043. Margaret's family is firmly against this possibility. Her great-niece wrote, "There are criminals who cannot be reformed. Gavin Ramsey is one of them. The law needs to be amended to consider individuals like Gavin Ramsey, who have demonstrated the evil that lies within them, a kind of evil that cannot be reformed or rehabilitated, and allows appropriate justice to be carried out in accordance with the current U.S. Supreme Court ruling on juvenile life without parole." Under the current law, Gavin will be in prison until at least 2043. What do you think about this horrific story? Should Gavin have parole? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, keep up with our channel, and we will see you very soon on The Decoder.